I'm a 28-year-old guy, and I recently moved out of my family home for the first time. Growing up, it was always me, my parents, and my two younger siblings, a sister and a brother. Our family has always been close, maybe too close. As the oldest, I got used to being the one who had to look out for everyone, to sacrifice my time, and to put others' needs before my own. It was just expected that I'd be the one to step in whenever there was a problem. A few months ago, I decided I needed to get some space to find out what it's like to actually have some time for myself. So, I moved into a small apartment across town. Not far enough that I couldn't see my family, but far enough that I thought I'd have a little more independence. I told my parents and siblings that I needed time to adjust and set some clear rules. No unannounced visits, and if anyone wanted to come over, they'd need to call ahead. Felt like a fair request. At first, everyone seemed to understand, but that didn't last long. Just a few days after I moved in, my mom showed up with a bunch of groceries. She said she was worried I wouldn't be eating properly and wanted to make sure I had real food. I appreciated it, I really did, but I reminded her that she needed to call before coming over. She waved it off, saying she was just being a mom and that it wasn't a big deal. The following weekend, my sister showed up at my place, suitcase in hand, saying she just wanted to crash for the weekend because she was tired of the noise at home. I hesitated but eventually let her stay, thinking maybe it was a one-time thing. But as she settled in, I realized this was starting to look like a pattern. It felt like my family didn't really get that my place was supposed to be my own space. Then came the constant group chat messages. If I didn't reply within a few hours, I'd get bombarded with messages like, "Are you okay?" and "Why aren't you answering?" It felt like I was right back at home under constant watch. Even when I tried to explain that I was just busy or wanted some time to myself, they didn't seem to understand. One time, my dad even showed up at my work unannounced. He thought it would be nice to surprise me and take me out to lunch. I was in the middle of a busy shift and couldn't leave, but he insisted on waiting until my break. It was awkward. My coworkers asked why he was there, and I just mumbled something about him being in the area. When I tried to explain later that he couldn't just show up like that, he brushed it off, saying he just wanted to spend time with me. After that, I decided I needed to have a serious conversation with my parents. I invited them over for dinner and laid everything out. I told them that while I appreciated their support, I needed them to respect my space and that the constant visits and messages were making it hard for me to adjust. I tried to make it clear that I wasn't cutting them out, just asking for a bit of distance. They laughed it off like I was overreacting. My mom said, "Oh, you'll get used to it," while my dad added that they were just being a loving family and that I'd understand someday. It was frustrating because they didn't seem to take any of it seriously. Meanwhile, my siblings started to push the boundaries too. My brother, Stefan, who's in his early 20s, began asking me to run errands for him, using the excuse that my apartment was closer to certain shops. When I told him I couldn't do it because I had my own stuff to handle, he acted like I was being unreasonable. He even made a snarky comment about how I was too busy now that I'd gone off to live the bachelor life. My mom also had a habit of dropping passive-aggressive remarks, like how she missed the old days when the family was all together. It felt like every time I tried to create some space, they'd find a way to pull me back in, whether it was through guilt or just ignoring my boundaries altogether. Feeling stuck, I turned to my close friends for advice. They were a lot more understanding than my family. They suggested I needed to set firmer boundaries and actually stick to them, even if it meant some pushback. So, I decided to send a message to the family group chat, laying out new visiting hours and emphasizing that I needed them to respect my personal space. For about a week, it seemed like they were actually going to respect it. There were no surprise visits, fewer messages, and I started to feel like I could breathe again. But then it all came crashing down when my parents invited me to a last-minute family dinner, and I turned it down. I told them I had plans already and couldn't make it, which led to a huge argument. They accused me of not caring about the family anymore and of becoming distant and selfish. I tried to explain that I just needed some time to myself, but they weren't hearing it. It ended with my dad saying something like, "I guess we're just not that important to you anymore," before hanging up the phone. That's when I realized that this was going to be a lot harder than I thought. The move was supposed to give me space, a chance to figure things out on my own, but instead, it felt like my family was tightening their grip even more, refusing to let go. I knew I had to hold my ground, but I had no idea how messy things were about to get. Update 1. A week after the blow-up over missing that last-minute family dinner, my parents showed up at my apartment unannounced. It was a Saturday morning, and I had just settled in with a cup of coffee, ready to enjoy a quiet weekend. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I checked the peephole, and there they were. My parents, standing there like they had every right to be on my doorstep without warning. When I opened the door, they started talking about how they were in the neighborhood and thought it would be nice to stop by. I stood there blocking the doorway, reminding them that I had asked for them to call before coming over, but they just kept going on about how they missed me and that they'd brought some leftovers from home. I stayed firm, telling them this wasn't a good time and that they needed to respect my space. Felt like they didn't even hear me. They looked surprised and hurt, like they couldn't believe I was actually turning them away. Eventually, they left, but they didn't go quietly. My mom muttered something about how they didn't raise me to be like this, and my dad just shook his head, clearly disappointed. I shut the door, feeling a knot in my stomach, but I knew I couldn't give in this time. After that, they didn't reach out for a few days. The group chat went silent, and my calls to them went unanswered. It was like they had decided to give me the cold shoulder. It was strange. My family had never really done the silent treatment before, and it made me second guess if I'd been too harsh. But I kept reminding myself why I set those boundaries in the first place. Then my sister started in on me. She began texting me multiple times a day, saying how our parents were heartbroken and that I should be more understanding of their feelings. She'd send long messages about how they just missed having me around and how I should remember all they did for me growing up. It was guilt trip after guilt trip, and it felt like she was trying to wear me down. I asked her to stop, but she didn't let up. One evening, I got a call from my mom. She sounded panicked, talking about how the dishwasher at home had broken and that water was leaking everywhere. Without thinking, I rushed over, worried it might be an emergency. But when I got there, it was just a small puddle under the machine. Nothing serious. My dad was already looking up repair services on his phone. It was clear that they could have handled it without me. It felt like a setup to get me to come back home, like they knew I'd drop everything if they sounded distressed. Couldn't hold back anymore. The next time I saw my sister, I confronted her about everything. The manipulative texts, the guilt trips, and how it felt like she was trying to make me choose between my family and my sanity. She turned it around on me, accusing me of acting like I was too good for the family ever since I moved out. It became a shouting match in the middle of my living room. In the end, she left in a huff, saying that I was the one who had changed, not them. Feeling completely lost, I turned to Reddit. I made a post about the situation, laying out everything that had been going on. I wrote about how I felt stuck between wanting to set boundaries and not wanting to push my family away. I asked if there was any way to find a balance or if I was being unreasonable by trying to have some space. The responses were overwhelming. Most people told me that my family wasn't respecting my boundaries and that I needed to start enforcing consequences if I wanted them to take me seriously. Some even suggested that I go low contact or take a step back from them for a while. A lot of what they said made sense, but I wasn't sure I could actually do it without feeling like I was being a bad son or a bad brother. So I decided to see a therapist. I found someone nearby who specialized in family dynamics and booked a session. I walked into that first appointment unsure of what to expect, but it turned out to be a real eye-opener. They helped me see that I wasn't being unreasonable for wanting some space and that it wasn't my job to manage my parents' feelings. It felt like the first time someone had given me permission to put myself first without making me feel guilty about it. After a few sessions, I came up with a new plan. I suggested to my family that I'd come over for dinner twice a month, but in return, they needed to respect my privacy the rest of the time. I thought it was a fair compromise, enough to show that I still cared without sacrificing my boundaries. My dad seemed open to the idea, saying that he could understand where I was coming from. My mom, though, wasn't thrilled. She kept saying it felt like I was distancing myself from the family, like I was phasing them out. My friends encouraged me to stick with it. They told me I was doing the right thing by standing up for myself and that setting boundaries wasn't selfish but necessary for my own well-being. It was good to hear, especially since I knew I'd need that support. Things got even more tense when my brother asked for my help with moving some furniture on a weekend I'd already made plans. When I told him I couldn't, he called me selfish and accused me of abandoning the family just because I didn't live at home anymore. To put another strain on our relationship, and I could feel the resentment growing between us. But this time, I didn't back down. I reminded myself why I moved out in the first place, to have a life of my own without feeling like I was constantly being pulled back into my old role. A few nights later, I came home from work only to find my mom waiting outside my apartment building. She told me she just missed me and wanted to see how I was doing. It was the same old story, and I realized that nothing had really changed. I told her again that she couldn't just show up unannounced. As I turned away, I could see her wiping away tears. It was the same routine all over again, pushing boundaries and then playing the victim when I pushed back. As I watched her leave, I knew this battle was far from over, and I had a feeling things were about to get even messier. Update 2. The day after my mom showed up outside my apartment, I got a barrage of texts from my siblings. My sister kept bringing up how our mom came home crying, saying I didn't even let her inside. She and my brother went on about how I was hurting our parents, making it sound like I'd done something terrible. The group chat blew up, with them taking turns trying to guilt me into apologizing, asking if I had forgotten everything our parents had done for us. It felt like they were ganging up on me, making me out to be the bad guy. I showed some of the messages to my therapist during our next session. They suggested that while I needed to keep reinforcing my boundaries, maybe I should also try to reassure my family that I still cared about them. It was about finding a way to stand firm without completely shutting them out. I wasn't sure how that would go, but I figured it was worth a shot. Not long after, I saw a post from my sister on Facebook. It was one of those vague posts that said something like, "Some people forget where they come from once they think they're better than everyone else." A few of our relatives liked and commented, saying things like, "Family should always come first," and "Hope everything's okay." It wasn't directed at me by name, but it was obvious who she meant. That post made its way around our family circles pretty quickly. Soon, I was getting awkward texts from aunts and uncles asking if everything was all right and if I'd worked things out with my parents. I figured it was time to try and clear the air, so I arranged a family meeting. I asked everyone to come over, hoping to get all of this out in the open and try to explain my side. I even brought a list of reasons why I needed some space and why the constant unannounced visits were making it hard for me to settle into my new life. I thought if I could just lay everything out, they might finally understand. It didn't go as planned. The moment I started talking about boundaries, my mom broke down in tears, saying that I didn't want to be part of the family anymore. She went on about how she had always tried to do everything for us and that she couldn't understand why I was suddenly pushing them away. My dad stood there, his arms crossed, looking more frustrated than anything else. He jumped in, saying that in our family, we've always been there for each other, and that I was the one changing the rules. To them, my need for space felt like a rejection. I tried to stay calm and explain that it wasn't about not wanting them in my life, but just needing some time to figure things out on my own. The conversation kept getting more emotional, with my mom crying and my dad saying it felt like I was abandoning them. My siblings stayed quiet, just watching as the whole thing unraveled. Eventually, I had to put my foot down. I told them that I couldn't keep sacrificing my own peace of mind to keep up with their expectations. That's when my dad shook his head and said something about how family should always come first, no matter what. After that, I knew things wouldn't be the same. The tension in the room was thick, and as they left, it was clear that a rift was forming. My dad barely looked at me on the way out, and my mom gave me this heartbroken look like she couldn't believe it had come to this. I could see it in their faces. They thought I was pulling away for good. Part of me worried that this could be the beginning of an estrangement. Not long after, I found out from a cousin that my brother had been keeping tabs on me, telling my parents about what I'd been up to. He'd mentioned seeing me out with friends a couple of times and even shared details about my social media posts. My parents took that as proof that I had time for other people, just not for them. It felt like a betrayal, like he was making me out to be someone who didn't care about the family at all. I tried to talk to my brother directly, hoping we could clear things up. We met up at a coffee shop, but it turned into another argument. He kept insisting that I changed since moving out, that I thought I was better than the rest of them just because I was living on my own. I tried to explain my side, but he wouldn't hear it. He left, still convinced that I was the one being selfish. After that, I decided to share an update on Reddit. I explained what had happened during the family meeting and how things had only gotten worse. The support I got was overwhelming. People kept telling me that I was doing the right thing by standing up for myself and that my family needed to respect my boundaries if they truly cared. A few even shared their own stories of going through similar struggles, which made me feel a little less alone in all of this. But then I started hearing more from relatives. A cousin called me, mentioning that my parents had been talking about me at family gatherings, saying I was difficult and that they didn't know what had gotten into me. It was clear that they were trying to shape the narrative, making it seem like I was the one who had suddenly turned against them. It stung, but at this point, I felt like I had to keep going with my plan. Update 3. The new security camera didn't take long to become an issue. A few days after I set it up, my parents showed up again, unannounced, early in the morning. I saw them through the camera feed on my phone, standing outside my door with a couple of grocery bags. I ignored the doorbell just like I said I would, but instead of leaving, they stayed there, looking around as if expecting me to suddenly change my mind and let them in. My mom even knocked a few times, calling out that they had brought some of my favorite snacks. It got awkward fast. I watched as they stood outside for a solid 20 minutes, shifting from foot to foot and glancing at the camera. Eventually, they realized I wasn't going to open the door. They left, but not without some frustrated looks toward the camera. I figured that would be the end of it, but I should have known better. The next day, I woke up to a long email from my dad. He laid out how disappointed they were in me, claiming that I was shutting them out and that they had only ever tried to help. But then he turned the tone around, saying that if I didn't start acting like part of the family again, they'd have to cut me off financially. I sat there staring at the email in disbelief. They had never directly supported me since I moved out, but I knew what he meant. Cutting me out of any future plans, maybe even removing me from the family will. It was a low blow, but it didn't surprise me at this point. That email hit me harder than I thought. I broke down for a while, realizing how far things had escalated. It felt like my own family saw me as an outsider just because I wanted some boundaries. After pulling myself together, I turned to Reddit again, venting about what had happened and asking for advice. The responses came pouring in, and the support was incredible. People told me that I wasn't alone and that my parents were being manipulative. Some suggested I look into my legal options just in case they tried to make things difficult for me down the line. I ended up meeting with a lawyer a few days later, just to be safe. I wanted to know if they could actually make things worse for me legally, like messing with any financial ties or trying to push me out of whatever inheritance might come in the future. The lawyer assured me that I was in a strong position, especially since I was financially independent and hadn't relied on my parents for anything since I moved out. It was a small relief, but I knew the situation was still far from over. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get messy, my mom showed up at my workplace during my lunch break. She tried to catch me as I stepped outside, insisting that we needed to talk. I told her it wasn't the time or place, but she kept pushing, following me to the parking lot. A few of my coworkers saw what was going on, and it got awkward quickly. I refused to engage and eventually headed back inside, leaving her there. Later that afternoon, HR called me in for a meeting. They told me that they understood family drama could be tough, but they couldn't have it spilling over into the workplace. They didn't issue a formal warning, but it was clear that this was a serious conversation. I left the meeting feeling even more trapped, like every corner of my life was being invaded. A few days later, things got worse. My brother had apparently been keeping tabs on my social media, and he started taking screenshots of posts where I was out with friends. He sent those to the family group chat, making it seem like I had all the time in the world for my friends but couldn't spare a minute for our parents. It was clear he was trying to paint a picture of me being the selfish one, which only made things more tense. I posted another update on Reddit, sharing what had happened with my workplace and my brother's screenshots. This time, the story gained a lot more traction. Hundreds of comments rolled in, with many people saying I needed to go no contact for a while if my family couldn't respect my boundaries. They encouraged me to put myself first and to consider taking a break from all the drama. I started seriously considering it, especially after what happened next. My parents showed up at my apartment again, but this time they brought my aunt and uncle with them. It was like some sort of intervention, with my relatives all gathered at my doorstep trying to convince me to let them in so we could talk it out as a family. I refused to open the door and told them through the camera that this wasn't the way to handle things. My mom started crying again, and my dad looked furious, but I didn't budge. They eventually left, but it felt like I had crossed another line that I couldn't uncross. After that, I decided I needed a break from all the constant pressure. I blocked my parents' and siblings' numbers, at least temporarily, just to get some time to clear my head. I explained on Reddit that I was overwhelmed and didn't know what to do next. Most of the commenters supported the decision, telling me that it was okay to take a step back and focus on myself for a while. A week later, I unblocked them. My phone immediately filled with dozens of messages. Some were apologetic, with my mom saying she missed me and that she wanted to go back to how things were. Others were angry, accusing me of tearing the family apart and being selfish. My brother even threw in a few jabs about how I was being cold-hearted and didn't care about anyone but myself. Hoping to clear the air, I arranged a meeting with just my siblings. I figured that without our parents there, maybe I could get them to understand my side. But the meeting quickly fell apart. My sister started crying almost immediately, saying that I had changed and that I didn't care about the family anymore. My brother accused me of being cold and shutting them out. It felt like nothing I said made a difference, and we left more upset than when we started. After that, I made a tough decision. I decided to go no contact with my parents for at least a month, hoping that this time apart would force them to realize that they couldn't keep ignoring my boundaries. The first week of no contact was eerily quiet. There were no surprise visits, no messages, nothing. I started wondering if they'd finally understood or if they were just planning their next move. Toward the end of the month, I got a letter in the mail from my mom. It was handwritten, filled with pleas for me to come back to the family and saying she didn't understand what she had done wrong. The letter sat on my kitchen counter for days, a reminder that even though I had taken a break, the situation was far from over. I brought it to my therapist and read it aloud during our next session. They pointed out that while the letter sounded heartfelt, it was still ignoring the root of the issue, my need for space and independence. My mom's words were more about how she felt than addressing the boundaries I had tried to set. Eventually, I responded with a letter of my own. I explained that I loved my family but needed them to respect my boundaries if we were ever going to have a healthy relationship. I laid out my conditions clearly. No unannounced visits, no guilt trips, and no attempts to manipulate me through other family members. I said I was willing to work toward rebuilding our relationship, but only if they were willing to meet me halfway. The response was mixed. My dad sent a brief email saying he understood, though it was clear he wasn't thrilled about it. My mom didn't reply directly, but I heard through my sister that she was still upset. My siblings were another story. My brother stopped speaking to me entirely, and my sister continued to post vague messages on social media that seemed aimed at me. Despite the ongoing tension, I started to feel more at peace. My therapist reminded me that I couldn't control how others reacted to my boundaries, only how I enforced them. Over time, I became more comfortable with the idea that it was okay to prioritize my own well-being, even if it meant disappointing others. Now, a few months later, things are still complicated, but I've started to find a better balance. My family and I talk occasionally, but I keep the conversations light and steer clear of anything that might lead to conflict. It's not perfect, but it's progress. For the first time in years, I feel like I have control over my own life, and that's a victory in itself.